history, it will bring life and purpose. That's when we're teaching the generation to come the mighty works of God. Another aspect of my study of history is that God is in control and has a plan for every individual and nation. As we study from this premise, it will help the individual to recognize that God has a plan for them. Young children can learn that. God made you for a special purpose. And He has something great He wants to accomplish in your life. If we look back at Psalm 78, which is the verse where we started, God says that we should declare His mighty works to the next generation. And He gives 3 reasons in those verses. First of all, that they might set their hope in God. If my children have heard, whether it's my own children in my home or the children in my classroom, if they have heard from me those recounting of those events when God has provided or protected, whatever the situation might be, they can know God's providence in my life. They will be encouraged when they face a difficult time in their lives. If they know how God provided food for the table today when they were 8 years old or whatever, when they're an adult and they are out of work or things are difficult for some other reason, they will know God can provide. Okay? They might set their hope in God. Another reason God says we should declare His mighty works is that they might not forget the works of God. How easily we can forget. I'm amazed, and we've been joking all week about our ages and all those things, and as we get older, how much more we forget. Have such a hard time remembering things. But we don't want to forget the works of God. And the third thing it says in those verses is that as we teach the mighty works of God to the next generation, they might keep His commandments. That's another one of the reasons. How important that is. So as we teach history from a providential approach, each student will begin to truly understand what God has done in the nation and in their own lives. And Mrs. Smith shared an example of the child saying, that's God's providence. Recognizing that and understanding that. They'll recognize that God has a plan for their lives and for our nation, and they will recognize they have a responsibility to carry out God's plan for their lives. In 1876, the centennial of our nation's independence, Reverend Foljam cautioned Americans. Whoop, we skipped something, sorry. Well, we'll just leave it there. He said, he cautioned Americans against a failure to study providential history. He said, the more thoroughly a nation deals with its history, the more decidedly will it recognize and own an overruling providence therein, and the more religious a nation it will become. While the more superficially it deals with history, seeing only secondary causes and human agencies, the more irreligious it will be. And do we see that in our nation today? Mr. Rose introduced you to 7 principles of America's Christian history and government. And we want to teach those principles in our history class. Now, as we master them, or begin to internalize them, they will really become a part of our lives. And we will recognize the relationship between Christianity and our nation. We'll recognize the relationship between internal Christian liberty in our hearts and external religious and civil liberty. Now, just to say this as a caution, you won't necessarily teach those principles explicitly to your children. In whatever, you're not going to teach the first grader the James Madison quote about conscience word for word, but you teach the ideas of those principles to them. Those principles will begin to govern your teaching. They will guide you in your own understanding, as you look for causes and effects, as you recognize God's hand and control, and developing and discerning as you develop materials about the character of those individuals that you are teaching. So let's talk a little bit then specifically about developing an elementary history course. Those things were all have to do with our philosophy of history, okay? As we develop a course, we should have some kind of course goals. If I'm getting ready to teach kindergarten math, I know that by the end of the year, I want them to be able to recognize, read and write numbers and understand what those numbers represent. I might want them to be able to do simple addition and subtraction problems. I want them to be able to count. I lay out a plan, right? We want to do the same for our history. But before we can lay out the plan, we have to have some goals. What do I want to accomplish? What do I want my children to know when they walk out the door? And the first goal is already up there for you. It says to recognize the providential hand of God in all events, past, present, and future. God has not made any mistakes in history. Sometimes we don't recognize his plan in the events as they happen because he hasn't shown us his plan yet. Mrs. Smith shared with us last night how she never wanted to get up and teach in front of adults, and that is what she does now. Sometimes he leads us and we don't recognize how he's leading in a particular event, but looking back, we can see it later. Okay? This gives hope, not only to us, but to our children, to know that God is working in all events. A couple of examples of how we can help our students to recognize God's providential hand in studying history. Think about creation. Okay? How do we define the very beginning of history on the earth? Even a very young child can learn that God made everything and has a plan for everything. Joseph, Moses, Esther are all wonderful biblical examples of individuals who God put in places of authority to accomplish some great purpose. Joseph, at the end of Genesis, we remember this story, how he was taken into slavery, and yet God put him in a place of authority in Egypt. And we just mentioned this last night, but he said to his brothers, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." God was working out his plan. No matter what the brothers thought they were accomplishing, God was working his plan. I told Mrs. Smith last night, she stole my examples, because we had the same ones and we hadn't even discussed it. Mordecai, I told Esther, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. The example of George Washington, protected in battle, that he might become the great leader of our nation. And the adorable little Minuteman on the slide is my son.